free to drop off and either contact Mike or myself, and we'll make sure that you get the email you a recorded version of today's session. Special note, there will be a Q&A at the end, so if you don't mind, keep your microphone on mute during the presentation. With so many of us still working from home, it's inevitable that someone will be firing up their leaf blower or some sort of outdoors, so keep the background noise to a minimum at best. If you do have a question, though, mid-presentation, I encourage you to either use the chat functionality or the raise your hand icon, and I'll do my best to weave that question into Matt's presentation. Also, speaking of the chat, do keep your eyes on it during our presentation today, as I'll be posting various updates, poll questions, and other things to make this a little more interactive. So with all the housekeeping out of the way, let's get down to some business. So my 8-year-old son has a saying he uses all the time when someone kind of catches him off guard, and he'll exclaim to everyone, "What in the heck in the world?" And everybody in the 3-block radius knows Patrick is confused. And I'm sure each and every one of you had a very similar experience the first time you clicked on the notice from the DoD that outlined CMMC 2.0. And with its release, the CMMC accreditation body, the DoD, and the Defense Industrial Base began not only searching for answers, but really, what questions should they even be asking? So as a result, KAMIND, we decided we are going to ask those questions, and we're going to ask them not only internally, but also to many of our trusted partners whose responses and reflections we'll be sharing throughout this presentation. We've leveraged their in-depth knowledge of the CMMC to try and better understand what lies ahead for members of the Defense Industrial Base. So to help you understand both the questions and the answers of CMMC 2.0, I'd like to introduce to you the CEO of KAMIND IT and, more fun, our best-selling author, Matt Katzer. Matt has over 20 years of cybersecurity experience. He's also been formally trained in the CCP training. And Matt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Brendan, and welcome, everyone. As we look at everything else, we have COVID, we have what's going on, we have Omicron, and we have CMMC 2.0. So if you don't like change, this is kind of an interesting world that we live in now. But if you look at what's really going on, so what I talked to Brendan, I talked to our team, and also our friends at Edwards, who's a C3PO, and also in terms of Future Feed folks and how the compliance organization, and even some of the other folks for the AB, we're really trying to actually look at how do we move forward and what really changed. And that's an interesting thing because when you look at CMMC 2.0, there are changes, but their timeline is still the timeline. And so let's go through and look and make sure that we're all in the same page. And, it's kind of interesting to see what's happened, because one of the first things it did is when they came out with the CMMC 2.0, and this is the new in terms of where the CMMC board by the DoD, you can actually go through and from a defense industrial base and get all the information. So information that we have or questions that we post, you can post them directly to the DoD, and this is kind of the source of truth. So we look at all this stuff, we look and saying, okay, now as we collect this information, as we look at things going on, I mean, many of us are starting down implementing the CMMC 1.0. We started putting the different processes in place and trying to deploy the NIST 800 171 practices. And also when we talk about CMMC, so make sure we're on the same page, and I'll go have some background, is that really CMMC 1.0 was the NIST 800, 171, and 172 plus the Delta 20. But to get all that is that when we look at the pieces and everything else, it's really trying to get the idea what's going on. Now, we just recently had in October, we did a virtual symposium. It was a half-day symposium that we actually had with KAMIND, with Microsoft, and Phil West from the director of the Modern Workplace in terms of he actually owned the CMMC product, the acceleration product. We also had Joy from Edwards, which is a C3PAO, and a learning organization and an assessment to understand the pieces, as well as, Mark Bierman, who basically the CEO of FutureFeed. And how do you actually look at the compliance? And all these pieces that you look at, it's just it's interesting how all this plays in place. And this is the type of thing when we look at thought leaders and decisions, because as owners of businesses and as our, the structure as a C-level staff, we look at the things and try to figure out what is the best way to actually move things forward. A little bit about KAMIND. This is third year running. We're an Inc. 5000 company. We're still the fastest growing company in the US. We've done a lot in terms of DoD. We're one of the first RPO in Oregon. And also we're basically one of the 54 partners in the US that can actually sell GCC high licenses and this is required for CMMC level 2 accreditation and also level 3. And also from a standpoint, we're tons of 365. I have over 290,000 books sold. So a lot of people ask about KAMIND and what we do and what really drives us, what really gets us out of the bed in the morning. And the real simple way to look is that we exist to prevent and solve big problems. CMC is one of them, but the bigger one that we're trying to address is this whole cybersecurity issue. How do we actually put security in the forefront? And security has been in my heart of what we do at KAMIND from day one. When I actually used to work for Intel Systems 2, which was basically the other side of Intel that had the government contracts and doing ComSec products and everything else. And when we looked at what CMMC, when we had our involvement back in starting looking at this back in 2016 and 2017, it was a very interesting problem. And how do we actually get ourselves in terms of a line from security? How do we protect ourselves? And how do we protect our digital assets? Because if you look at our business today, especially with what COVID has done, our assets are our digital assets and we have to protect them. Now, the interesting thing, let's go turn the clock back at CMMC 1.0 so we frame the discussion. So I'd have a few slides just kind of talk about this and specifically about where it comes from. The whole concept of CMMC was where you basically built in cybersecurity as a core foundational block. And if you look in terms of the NIST 800-171, that's what it's really trying to do. It's not something you add on, you build it into the full core fundamentals. That's really how you're going to secure organizations. So you have to totally look at things differently. That's why you're running through situations like right now. Microsoft is introducing Windows 11. Windows 11 requires a TPM 2.0, the trusted profile modules in all the PC's devices. That contains in all the encryption keys. So they're obsoleting all the other old hardware. They're moving things forward with new levels of encryption. CMC is what they're trying to do the same thing, the DoD, build that fundamental base on it. And the CMC, just for history, they have a concept of domains and in terms of what actually the structure, and they have grouping of the domains. And, as you see with NIST 800-171, we have the same thing. And in the CMC domain model, they had a combination of processes and practices, and that came out and get to what we known as we call the CMC template. And this is like looking at a Microsoft 365 E5 running in Azure Gov in terms of what's really covered under CMMC 1.0. Now you see all these different practices and everything else. And so when you look at what CMC was trying to do, 1.0 is saying we need to put the practices in place. We need to put the processes to make sure we documented what we need to do. And we need to put the plans in place to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do and we're actually budgeting. That was the whole purpose of looking at the concept, the construction of CMC 1.0. And when you look at this, there's really what CMC 1.0 is. It is the NIST 800-171/172 and what we call the Delta 20, which is those additional practices that made CMC 1.0. Now in the CMC 1.0, we call the old model, just for reference, you have to go through a NIST 800-171 scoring. You're going to have to scope assessment saying, okay, hey, where do you have CUI? That's a controlled unclassified information. Where is FCI? Where is CDI? Where's the different things? Where are those things located? You have to do a gap assessments in terms of are you basically how you compare against the NIST 800-171, the Delta and the Delta 20. How is about the CMC? How are you going to implement it? And then you actually do the assessment where you bring in a third-party assessor to actually to prove that you're doing what you're doing, because that's the whole purpose. And then you put some type of security model around so you have a continuous improvement. Because as we know in security today, you can no longer set it and forget it. So throw the whole CMC model out, for example, if you look at any type of client that has a security environment infrastructure in place, you manage security as a continuous process. And that's key. So when you look at the process model, just specifically, you're going to go through a scoring, you're going to go through a scope assessment, you're going to do gap, and then you do implementation. And that gets you this timeline that we know as in the 1.0 timeline. We're the tail end of 21 going 22. There's hard dates put in place that basically you got to make sure you buy 10/1/2025. You better have everything in place if you want to bid on contracts and everything else. So that's kind of the hard core of what's going in place. That's what's going in place. So now, given that, the big question that everybody has, what's changed? What's the big fuss? Why the change and everything else? And how do we actually plan for these change, or what do we need to do? And a lot of questions we have from clients is, well, we're already down on the implementation of 1.0. What do we need to do? What do we need to do? Does that mean all the work we've done is no longer valid? How do we actually handle these things, and how do we actually mow? Well, to actually answer that question, let's go look at the model that's posted by DoD. And what they actually did, if you go on the left-hand side, we actually see in terms of the old model that we actually have. And on the old model, we basically, we have level 5 for the 3, 2, we have the different practices. There's 130 practices here, 171. Now, under the new model of CMMC 2.0, you have in terms of the 110 practices, which is in NIST 800 and 171, which, by the way, is also in the CMMC level 1.0. It's a NIST 800, 171 plus the Delta 20. And now you have level 3, which is the 172. And by the way, if you know CMC like level 4 and 5, there really is no other side practices. That is the 172. So there's really hasn't been any change. They just kind of merged it together. So that gives you an idea where the thinking is. The real change in terms of what's happening is that how you actually do assessments. So if you're thinking from a standpoint as an organization, how do you actually want to implement it, or what's the cost structure on this? Well, you're still going to have to implement NIST 800, 171. You're still going to have those expenses and things in place. What happened with the 2.0 model, they changed the model in terms of the assessment. So basically you can do self-assessing. And we're going to talk more about the pros and cons and what happens with that later. Now, we're going to talk about pros and cons of self-assessment. Now, KAMIND, we're basically an implementation company. We're not a C3PAO. So we're basically not in the business of assessments. We're in the business of helping clients get implementation on the CMMC 2.0 changes and how to actually put security in the environment. That's really what that's really what we do. That's our core. So I took this directly out of the DoD site, so you can actually see the same slides there to make sure they're on the same page. But basically what they really did with CMMC 2.0 is they basically decided, hey, let's just go pick the NIST framework and the NIST 800, 171, and 172, and let's just make it align the model to acceptable standards so they basically remove the Delta 20. The other change that they actually did is they said, okay, how can we affect, because one of the big concerns we had clients and of clients all alike is how do you actually reduce the assessment cost? Well, you add self-assessment. But there's some caveats on that. So we have to and we'll talk about that implementation and what the impact is. And the third thing they did is because there's a hard date of CMMC 1.0 had no POEM, that's plan of operation milestones. What they did is basically said that let's allow flexible implementation. So we're going to allow waivers under certain limited circumstances. But, before you go through and say, well, geez, I can run my XP system or I don't have to change this stuff, you got to be careful because basically the waivers are going to be very few and hard between. And like in terms of what's going on with Microsoft with Windows 11, the TPM 2.0 implementation is going to be paramount in basically almost any workstation or device you put in place. So the question is, and the reason for that is a very direct one. The TPM 2.0 modules that are being pushed out into all hardware, and this started actually in 2018, is that basically these are the new encryption algorithms that are needed to secure like the desktop operating systems. So there's a lot of moving parts behind the scene, and don't go assume that, geez, I'm going to get a waiver for what I have, because basically the goal is still the same goal, is how do we actually secure how do you score the DIBs, and how do we get a baseline that everybody knows what's going on. And that's kind of the pieces of it. Looking at the CMC model, and I kind of added, where does the NIST 800 172 fit, and where does the NIST 800 171? So you actually see the pieces. Now, in terms of what happened in terms of level 4 and 5 and the new level 3, that's pretty much the same. That hasn't really changed. Though the change is really in the NIST 800 171. That is so-called the Delta 20. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what is this CMMC Delta 20? What was actually removed? So what I did is I pulled out in terms of the features that were removed from the prosody level. Now, let's go look at this stuff, and I'll be really blunt. If you're like this AU 2.044 review audit logs, if you're not reviewing your audit logs right now, I'd be surprised, and there's probably a different discussion that you probably need to have, because I know a lot of the insurance companies would not be happy about that, especially in your cyber policies. How do you actually do event reporting? If you detect and report events. Well, we have in terms of and you look at a lot of the rules in terms of GFAR rules that they have, a lot of these things you have to do anyway. It's just not part of the standard from a model standpoint, but you're going to do the implementation. And the other one is that we run it all the time. We run it in the commercial side. How many people actually regularly perform tests on their data backup? I mean, it's obvious you should do that, but those are things that people need to do. And so you're looking at type of things that what was removed, but these are common practices. So it's just that they kind of change, and you're still going to have processes built around it. And looking at some of the maturity level 3 processes, you'll see certain other thing is that, well, collect audit logs in a central repository. Well, from like KAMIND, when we actually deploy a customer tenant, commercial side or in terms of the defense industrial contractor, we use something called log analytics. We centralize all logs into a main tenant because we can pull data easier. So a lot of these things you look at in terms of what happens, this is just common practices today. So it's the main difference is, we're still like you're implementing DNS and you're doing spam filters, and you're basically using, email to detect, phishing emails that come in. A lot of the things that in the Delta 20 you're doing right now. The main difference is that you're not basically being required to accredit it. But okay, so we take we set this aside. So we have the Delta 20 now. We move that out of CMMC 2.0. Well, what's left? Now, I thought the simplest way to actually show this was go back to the Microsoft CMMC maturity template for CMMC 1.0. And what I did is I updated it to with removing of the Delta 20. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing the CMMC for an MS365 E5 SKU with a placemat with the older CMMC 1.0 practices removed. Those are the black box. So this thinking about when you look at in terms of what's going on, there is still a lot of work to be done. There's still things you need to do. It hasn't changed. You have to go implement a NIST 800 171. What you're doing now is you're actually going through and figuring out how to do self-assessment. So all the stuff you do, where is CUI? How to do a gap assessment. What is your SPUR scores? All that stuff you have to do. And what's happened is a lot of the pieces that people think that maturity processes from the Delta 20 was removed, but when you actually go look in terms of what the DFARS is requiring, the new regulations, you got to do all those maturity processes anyway. So a lot of this stuff that you're seeing is basically, it hasn't changed they basically made it easier in some ways, but they also kept the same bases in place. And the best way to look at this, and we get that out of their process model that I had earlier, is it's saying, okay, let's look at our original CMMC 1.0 process model. And let's say we want to go for an L2. Now, the big thing that you have in the L2 on this big change in the diagram, see, I'm still doing the scoring, I'm still doing the scope assessment, I'm still doing the gap assessment, I'm still doing my implementation. However, in my assessment now, I'm doing a self-assess or I'm using a third party. That was the biggest change. And then as you go look at it, you have to say, okay, am I going to put a security management around it and everything else? And how do you actually handle those situations? So when I went through and look into, there's a meeting the other day from the CMMC-AB, and they had a really good slide that I kind of pulled out that I thought this was really good, that gives you the idea of the pieces of it. So under the new model that you actually have in terms of the level 1, which is the foundation model, which is basically the maturity level 1 before, you have an annual self-assess. You still need to actually go look at it. And it's all looking for stuff that's not critical for national security. And that's the foundationals, which is stuff that you should be doing every day. Like how many people are not implementing MFA on their environment? Or how many people are not following like a regular, do you have a 15-character password on your printers or your routers? Are they encrypted? What type of things? Those are the fundamental stuff that it needs to be put in place that you have. Now, when you look at level 2 is interesting. This is where you start getting the difference in terms of, and this is based on the contracts. You have a self-assess on an annual base on CUI that's non-prioritized in terms of why your contract reads. And then you also have CUI that's prioritized acquisition that you have to actually go through a triannual third-party assessment and through a C3PO or a DoD. Now, and then you also have in terms of level 3. Now, what people, and which is going to be a government-led through DIPCAP in terms of assessment. Now, what people misinterpret and they don't understand with the changes to 2.0, like with 1.0, you could say I could do level 3, the old level 3, and basically automatically get level 1. This is not the case now in terms of the 2.0 model. You have to basically go through the 2.0 model. You actually have to put in place
This is called CMMC. It's a cybersecurity.
Boring. I know you need to. I know.
So
need to
when you
learn
put in
to
place of level 2, for instance, you actually have to go through an assessment of level 2 before you can actually go through the formal assessment for level 3. So it hasn't changed. It's still put the same pieces in place. Now you look at a CNC process flow, still the same. You got to do score, you got to do scoping, you got to do gap, you got to do implementation. I mean, that's the type of things that you look at in terms of changes. So, well, the question is, what does this mean? Well, to put it in a nutshell, the timeline's the same. Nothing's really changed there. Now, DoD is going to come up with a new timeline. They're going to soften some things, but they're still marching to the same timeline. So if you haven't started doing your NIST 800 171 deployment, you better start doing some of those pieces. The difference is they got more friendly in terms of what you need to do. So it ends up being this whole issue from when do you need to be formally assessed versus what you do for self-assessment. So in terms of, you look at what I see, so the OSC, the organization, the requirement assessment can perform the self-assessment and it's based on the contract. So if you're foundational level 1, perform the annual self-assessment. And if you're level 2, if that's where your contract puts you at, it depends the contract, because some portions of contracts are going to have a triannual assessment. They're going to have to go through a C3PO, and the other parts can be self-assessed. And that's going to be contract-based. And then level 3, that's going to be done by DIPCAC. And you're going to have to go through a formal assessment. And if you're going to go through level 3, what you're actually doing is that you better basically figure out if you're going to actually use a third-party tool like FutureFeed or something, how you actually put the data together. All those things you talk about in terms of CMMC 2.0. Do you have the processes in place? Do you have the plans in place? Do you have the policies in place? And do you have the object evidence collected? You need all that for assessment. And quite bluntly, if you self-assess, you still need all that information as well. Because even if you self-assess, DIBCAP can come in and basically go validate the assessment. Because one of the whole problems, you go back to history of CMMC 1.0, why the formal assessments came in place was because nobody was doing the self-assessments and being accurate with them. And that's the other change that they actually have in terms of assessment, is the assessment now that when you actually go through and do a self-assessment or a self-attestation, you submit that to DIBCAP. That is the owner of a company or a C-level individual that's going to be personally liable for the implementation in the company. Now, you may say that, well, what does that really mean? Well, the other change they did, if you go look in terms of what the Christian doctrine in terms of on the federal contract, you have whistleblowers now. And the way the new rules are changing is a whistleblower can get 30% of the collection fees if someone actually has malfeasance or things associated with, and the DOJ goes after a defense contractor that's not implementing or falsified information. So what's happened is that, yeah, self-assessment's there, but they raise from a point of saying that, well, you can self-assess, but if you go through that self-assessment, there's a higher bar that you need to go through. It's like at us at KAMIND, for instance. You know, our policy, we do security clients. We implement NIST 800-171. We go through and implement at a level 1 across all our security clients. Period. That's what we do. And then we do incrementals on top of it. We document the plans and policies. We document the processes. And the reason for that, because if we're challenged because maybe we have an issue of, you know, ransomware or something like that, or from our cyber insurance company or whatever. So when you actually go through a legal system through a court that you actually get involved in, you got to come back and say, hey, we implemented according to the standard. In fact, we did above the standard. So you get a point that you have a defense boundary. But if you're not implementing against a standard and you run in those situations, you're going to come through and basically you're going to be basically put on the, you know, in terms of the chopping block, did you do what you're supposed to do? So it becomes super, super important to pay attention to what's going on. And this is the big change. Now, the other change we look in terms of stuff in terms of POAMs. Now, on one of the big issues people had, well, we're going to get our, you know, we don't have all the pieces. It takes us time. So we're going to do a plan of action milestones, so how we're going to get there. Well, kind of keep in mind, you do POAMs, you know, called the 5 pointers. And when you look at it, how it affects your scoring. And this all comes into a scoring. The scoring is really super important because as we go scoring how you actually do the implementation, you're going to be listed in EMAS in terms of where your score is, and also what's your confidence level on your score. Now, DoD is also going to have waivers and everything else, but keep in mind, they're really restructuring what the waivers are. And they're going to be basically is applied to a CMMC requirement, not individual cybersecurity practices. And that's kind of interesting. So it's really talking about, you know, you may have a different practice of how you implement cybersecurity, but the real issue, you can't go like you did in the past to say, hey, our practices are better and we should get a waiver for it. What you're saying now is you're looking at, I'm not going to implement AU 2.04, I need a waiver associated with it. So very specific type thing. So that's kind of the other change. Now, just to put you in frame of the pieces on it, so when you start looking in terms of what this means from like a NIST 800-171 or 172, so you go on 172 deployment, which is very similar to an 853, is that you basically have to go through an accreditation process and go, by the way, it's going to be done by DIBCAP. And if you look at level 2 and level 1, then you start going self-attestation plus accreditation, depending on what you want to do. So that's kind of, you have flexibility on what that means and how that works. And keep in mind, I put this slide up here, just remember, so here's the Delta 20, a lot of stuff you still have to do. This is a NIST 800-171. So, And you see, and this is basically the stuff, what you actually have to look at and what you want to do. Now, you may not use like Microsoft 365 and GCC High. This will be different. This is the type of spreadsheet that can be adjusted for it. But you have to internalize what you need to do, and you have to put the necessary processes and practices in place. So the question that we're always asked, how do you move forward? Well, really, and it's like, you know, that they're good from the standpoint is basically they said, hey, start with a self-assessment. But you got to keep in mind what you're actually going to do. Self-assessment is that you're going to submit the scoring. You know, you're going to do an S800 171 scoring. You're going to have both, you're going to self-attestation to say how you're doing. But the questions you have, if you go through an attestation, you get that information logged up in the EMAS database, how are you going to compare against your competitors? Because one of the other things that was happening, and when they actually did the base assessments, they structured it so that DoD now has access to look and saying that, oh, let's look at all the contractors. Let's see what your CMMC score. Did you self-attest or did you get accreditation? Because if you do a self-attest, you get a low. Now, if you're looking in terms of different programs that are going on and contractors saying using or primes or basically subs, and the subs numbers are all in there as well, they're going to start looking at this and say, well, geez, we're going to allow you to use sub A. You have sub A has a low, they, you know, bid $20 for the project, just making some number of, or $2 million for the project, and sub B, they basically went through a formal accreditation and they spent $2 million for the project. Which one do you think DoD is going to basically authorize for that contract? They're going to go to the low person or they're going to go to the high person? They're going to go to the person that's going to basically safeguard the information. And that's what you need to internalize. So you're looking at this from a standpoint of how you want to actually compete in the market and how you're going to put the necessary practices in place. And then the other pieces that we look at, and this is really important, you start looking at these pieces, then you start looking and saying what, from a compliance, are you going to be compliant with what's going on? Because now you get into the mode of, I did my self-assess, I did my annual numbers. So as you go through between 1 year to another on a self-attest, you basically better have a process in place that's going to improve your scores and make sure those POAMs get implemented if you went through a self-attest model. And I bring up the quote that I like the best, and this is really comes down to, from Peter Drucker said, is very simple. What is measured improves. Now, when you think of that, when you talk about SPUR scores and everything else, what you're doing is you're not, you know, DoD is going to look in terms of confidence factors. You as an organization, myself as a business owner, we're going to look specifically in terms of what happens in the organization. How do we measure? Have we improved? Have we moved the needle forward? And in order to do that, when you actually look at it, you're going to have to probably use some other SaaS tools. We use Future Feed, for instance, and basically to get those things so you start doing the assessment. Now, in this case, this is like a NIST 800 171, the old CMMC tool. We have the new version CMMC 2.0, but these are the type of things you need to do. And you look at all those pieces and you go through, we're back to the same process that we had before. We're going to have to do our score. We're going to have to do a scope assessment. We're going to have to do gap. We're doing our implementation, and we're going to come through and say that, okay, you know, I'm either going to self-attest or I'm going to hire a C3PO to actually do the accreditation. And that's a business decision you need to make. And I think initially a lot of people are going to self-attest, but as we get through, they're expecting, and DoD is expecting a lot of people to go through self-accreditation and submit. Like even for ourselves at KAMIND, we're actually going to submit ourselves so that we can do the necessary accreditation for level 2. So we'll be going through the assessment process. But as you look through this whole thing, you got to remember one thing. The clock is ticking. And when you think about the clock is ticking, you got to keep in mind that there's 300,000 contractors. And you know, in terms of what has in provisional assessors. Now, some of this has changed because you can do self-assessment, so it's easier. But as you go through and try to compete to get those government contracts to build your revenue base, you need to start looking at things from a different perspective. because the timeline hasn't changed. And that's what you need to really internalize in terms of what CMMC 2.0. There are changes afoot. You basically need to put your due diligence in place, build out the necessary POAMs that you have, figure out what type of SaaS tool you want to actually measure to actually collect the data, and basically get yourself ready, because what you're doing, all DoD really did is saying that we're going to remove the formal assessment. You still have to do all this stuff. You have a little bit more time. We'll give you some POAMs. But if you want to be competitive on the contract side, basically, you better make sure your SPR scores are anything other than low, and so you have better selection criteria when basically contracts are awarded. So what do? That's really the next step. Well, basically, there's a couple things. If you're going to be in level 2, if you're moving level 2, level 3, you need to move in your licenses, your 365 licenses in GCC High. And this is really important from us. You look at it because Microsoft is changing a lot of license requirements next year, and prices are increasing, so there's a decision people have to make. Now, one of the things that we're doing with CMMC 2.0, we created at KAMIND, we have a CMMC 2.0 self-assessment kit. And so we can actually help you get on that bandwagon. So really contact us, go fill out the feedback form, and give us a shout, and let's see how we can help you. But if you take anything away from today, take away this: the timeline hasn't changed. You're going to have to implement NIST 800-171. If you go through a formal accreditation, it really is going to come down to where do you want to be in the queue when contracts are awarded. With that, let me show it over to you, Mr. Brandon, and see if there's any questions.
Absolutely, Matt, thank you very much. A note for all the participants, attendees, I have put a link in the chat. Actually, it would really help if I hit the send button. That is your link to provide feedback on our webinar today. I didn't get any questions in the meeting chat, so if you have any questions, either myself or Matt are here to answer. Feel free to go ahead and unmute, and I will gladly answer the question. It looks like we might have one coming through the chat, but if you'd like to, feel free to unmute. I believe I've taken that off, and I will be able to help. So, Matt, this is a good question. Our friend Mark asked the question, who do I go to self-assess? And so I think what Mark is asking is kind of specifically, what are the nuts and bolts around a self-attestation for a OSC?
Well, the self-attestation is actually published by DoD. There's a self-attestation guide in terms of the steps you need to go through. You know, what's evaluation, what's the point score associated with it. There's a couple ways you get that link. You can get it through the NIST folks directly. You can also get it from the SPRs on the PI site. And that's the performance indicated, I forget what the DoD calls the whole PI environment, but that's where you submit your contract information. And there's a link associated with there with a self-assessment. And what an assessment starts with, just for those that are thinking about it, you start off with a negative score, like minus 200, and then you go to the most you can get is 110. So, and that's how you actually go through and do your self-assessment. And keep in mind, when you do the self-assessment, you're doing the self-assessment for the whole 110.
Mark, good question. I don't have access to it. I don't have it in my filters. If I don't have it by the time we log off, I will make sure to send it to you and gladly take care of that for you. Thank you, Mark. Any other questions? Great question, Mark. Anyone else? Again, feel free to enter it into the chat, or also feel free to just go ahead and unmute and ask away.
I should also add that if you have a active contract, you were supposed to file your SPURS score starting last year, so December 1st or so. So you should already have your SPURS numbers put together. If you haven't, you want to seriously get those put in place pretty quick before you get into FY22.
I'm glad you brought that up. So, Mark, I believe I can answer this question. I want to make sure I have it correct, though. You mentioned that you believe your team was going for level 3. So you mean you were attempting to achieve level 3 status under CMMC volume 1 or version 1, and now you're looking at going. Is that the question? Just so I make sure I'm answering this. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Sorry. I was waiting on your chat and then you unmuted. Thank you. So the simple answer is, so what was once known as level 3 is now known as level 2. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of the current slide, it is sort of the advanced level. Now, that comes with a little bit of an asterisk. And so what that means specifically is there's going to be certain types of CUI that requires the specific controls that will need professional assessment. So we haven't gotten that guidelines from the the DOD, sort of the old Potter Stewart line, but the Justice Potter Stewart. But if you have CUI that you think is on the higher end of things, pretty much assume you're going to need a C3 PAO to certify that, but we don't have the specific criteria yet. That's sort of you're asking the question specifically in the gray area, but understand that the good, cyber hygiene that was established by level 3 is now known as level 2, and that's all of NIST 800-171, and I sent you the link of what that document looks like. I'm still working on finding the self-attestment. So, Mark, awesome question.
Great. So just keep chugging along from the lowest to the top until somebody says stop.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you want to keep going to level 3, hey, good on you. But if you thought level 3 in the original version was where you were going, I don't think you have to go to the current level 3. That is a different whale by all means. So great question, though. Mark, follow up. Do you have a follow up for that, and anyone else?
I'd just like to add real quick on it. If your goal is to go to the new level 3, which is the old level 4 to 5, what that means is that you're going to have to get a formal accreditation at level 2 before you get to level 3. So as you look through the pieces and chug through, if you're going through a formal accreditation, if that's the plans, I would look at a tool like FutureFeed, ComplyUp, there's a couple others. Ours, we kind of chose FutureFeed. And basically start building out just like before, your policy, process, and plans, and collect your object evidence and build the pieces into it, because that's what you're going to be doing. And that's what's going to be expected from the accreditation. And that's also what's going to be expected when you do level 3.
No, that's a great clarification, Matt, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was something we learned earlier this week in a conversation with the members of the CMMC-AB during their town hall session. And we had a great a speaker during that portion, Allison Great Giddens she's the president of WinTech, who is official title is the DIB representative to the CMMC-AB, and she had mentioned in many ways, Mark, that she has kind of a similar challenge with her organization. Not totally sure if she's 2 or 3, but she knows 2 at some point. And there's a lot of work that can be done on the back end, things like documentation, various controls that involve physical security. So there's a lot of work that can be done, even if you're not in that, level 2. So that was her recommendation specifically. So I thought that was really helpful. Any other questions, Mark? Awesome job. Thank you. Just a heads up, I put for some reason, when I first put the feedback question in there, the link didn't necessarily pop up correctly. So I've reinserted it into the chat. I want to make sure it looks like we might not have any more questions. So this is a absolute treat for Matt. He gets a whole 13 minutes back in his day, which in my 2 years working with Matt, this might be a brand new record, which is really exciting for him. But if there are no other questions, I'd love to give everybody their 13 minutes back. Okay. Well, it looks like we've done. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. We normally introduce what our next webinar topic is going to be, but our next webinar topic is a TBD because we want to wish everyone a very safe holiday season upcoming, and most importantly, a successful close to their 2021 and a prosperous start to 2022. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Wish you all happy holidays and a good new year.